Well, I think we'll move on. We're all kind of anxious to hear what David has to say. So my introduction to David Morris, he grew up in the Welland area, but has been living in our area since 1992. And we've enjoyed his expertise in many outings and presentations since he joined OSFN. He was educated at the University of Guelph and became a crop and soil advisor for OMAFRA. And he was definitely the plant experts, mostly for the farming community. Now we get to enjoy, again, in his lifelong interest in plants and his good sense of humor. So take it away, David.
All right, there we go. Thank you. Thank you, Pam. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening. My intent is to just say a little bit more about myself, and then I will go to my presentation. So I'll put it on screen share and take my video off so I won't be any distraction. As Pam mentioned, I grew up in the Niagara area and in the country, and I have developed an interest in plants at an early age, I guess thanks to my grandfather, because from the time that I can remember, certainly since as soon as I had the hand-to-eye coordination to handle a hoe properly, I worked with him in looking after our vegetable garden. And after he died when I was in early high school, I became the main vegetable gardener at our place. So I spent much of my lifetime looking down at what was growing around my feet and have maintained that all along. And when I began working with the Ministry of Agriculture and Food in the 1970s, a big part of my job was working with farmers to help them identify what weeds that were growing in their fields and what to do in terms of controlling them if such was necessary. So it became necessary to be able to recognize the more common ones on site and have a means of figuring out the ones that I didn't know relatively from the guides that we had. And I became reasonably skilled at that, I would say, as a non-botanist. I don't pretend to be a botanist, I'm an agriculturist. One of my former colleagues used to claim that I could identify weeds at 50 miles an hour, but that was something of an exaggeration, to put it mildly. Certainly I can tell a giant hogweed at 50 miles an hour, but not much else. So that's my brief introduction. So my talk about tonight is I've called Resident Aliens. And so I am now going to turn off my video and go to screen share. And so we will get, hopefully that'll work. And where are we here? There we go. So you should now be seeing a picture that shows some funny little creatures that say Resident Aliens. I'm not going to talk about those kinds of aliens. If you want to learn about the ones from outer space, you need to tune into AM radio in the middle of the night and listen to Coast, and you can learn all the conspiracy theories about invaders that you want. So, oops, if this would just, oops, what is going on here? My screen, oh, there we go. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is plants that came from somewhere else, hence the name aliens. I realize the resident aliens is an American term, but alien species was what I learned to tack on to plants that didn't belong here. I suppose Canadian would call them landed immigrants or something. But they are plants that have been here long enough that we take them granted as part of the landscape. I think in some cases we even forget that they did come from somewhere else. But we have literally hundreds of species, very common in this area, that did not originate in this area, and many of them did not start on this continent. So quickly, so how and why did they show up here? Many of them came intentionally as crops of one kind or another. Field crops, particularly, are hay and forage crops, fruits and vegetables. All of our major tree fruits, for example, apples, pears, cherries, have come from somewhere else. Many vegetables, lots of ornamentals, of course, and herbs in the vegetables. Herbal medicines, some for soil conservation, and I'll touch on some representatives of each of those categories as I go along tonight. And when I got to the end of this, I realized, oh, there's another category, and that was fiber crops. The two most known examples there were cannabis, which was grown in this throughout Ontario for a source of fiber for rope, especially during the wartime. And it has naturalized in some areas where there used to be a rope factory. And the other one was flax for linen. That is not naturalized to any degree that I'm aware of. So those are the intentional ones. The accidental ones were contaminants in seed or hay or straw or manure. It's easy for us to forget that many of almost all the sailing ships that came over here had livestock on them in one type or another, horses, some for breeding stock, some as a means for providing food for people along the way. And they all ate, and they all relieved themselves of what they didn't digest. And certainly seeds can go through livestock and became viable quite easily. Potted plants would be another potential source. Ship's ballast, so the rocks that they put in the bottom of the ship probably have dirt on them with seeds in it. More recently, buying used farm equipment from the United States has brought in various species. And there's some suspicion that migrating birds may have seeds in or on them in some cases. So moving now to the specific species, I thought, okay, how do I organize this? And so I kind of going from early flowering to late flowering, but jump around from, okay. I just had a bit of a distraction here, sorry. Going from spring to fall, and some I've lumped by family together. But beginning with the one that's earliest in the spring is the Coltsfoot. It can look a lot like dandelions when you first see it in the spring, but it flowers a couple of weeks before dandelions, and there's no leaves. And the flower stalk has the bracts on it that we see in this lower flower, unlike dandelions. And the flower and the seeds look much like dandelion. The leaves, of course, are very different, and it's the shape of the leaf that gave rise to the name Coltsfoot, somewhat like a horse's hoof. The Latin name Tussilago is derived from the Latin word for cough, because this was used as a cough medicine. That may be why it was introduced here. More recent chemical analysis has identified a number of alkaloid compounds in Coltsfoot that, if overused, could cause liver disorders. So as with many of these herbal medicines, use them carefully and know what you're doing before you start to self-medicate with them. Coltsfoot still is in the invasive category, partly because the seeds spread much like dandelions, and also because it has rhizomes that connect the new plants together and give rise to new shoots, unlike dandelion, which has taproot. So you can very quickly go from a few plants to a pretty solid infestation, and thus one to watch for if you haven't already got it. It's spread itself pretty well over many areas already. So I've mentioned dandelion. We need to say a few words about this. It's kind of an interesting sample. because its origin and when it got here are still up for debate. It's a very old species. In Europe, it probably, I think it goes back to pre-Ice Age days, thought to maybe have originated around the Mediterranean, but by the time people got trying to figure out where it came from, and it spread all over Europe and Asia. There's varying theories as to when it came to North America. One school of thought says it came across from what we now call Siberia at the end of the last ice age, when there was a land bridge between Siberia and Alaska. Eastern North America, it appears to have got here almost as early as the first Europeans did. One theory said that the Vikings brought it, but certainly one that was been here for a long time. Probably came as a food crop. The leaves are edible. The roots can be eaten. Also can be used as a source of alternate for coffee. Flowers, many of you have heard of dandelion wine, or more properly called dandelion flavored wine, but they can be, the flower buds can be eaten as well. Just a note of caution, if you are going to eat it, be aware that it's a well-known diuretic, and one of the French or European names for it translates to, quote, wet the bed. So you have been warned. Moving along in towards the middle of May, one of the next ones that becomes quite visible is one in the mustard family called yellow rocket. If you see it along the roadside and ditch banks, it's a perennial, so it tends to be seen on areas that are not disturbed. Unlike wild mustard, which it can look a lot like, which is an annual weed that shows up on cultivated land. Wild mustard comes a couple of weeks after yellow rocket. Been here quite early, probably came as a somewhat as a source of food, vegetable, because the leaves are edible. It can be used in salads. It tastes somewhat like cress, apparently. The leaf looks a lot like cress. It was also used as a poultice to heal wounds, and that's the derivation of the Latin name for it, Barbarea. Saint Barbara was the patron saint of artillerymen, and so they honored the plant that they used to cure their wounds by giving her name to the Latin name for this species. The other rocket that's very common, of course, is Dame's rocket, or sometimes called false flax, or false phlox, wild phlox, but it's not a phlox. It's a mustard family. The Latin name Hesperis is derived from the Latin word for evening because of the tendency for Dame's rocket to be much more fragrant overnight and in the evening than it is in the daytime. As you probably are aware, it is a very fragrant flower, and probably came here mainly as an ornamental for the appearance of the flower and the aroma thereof, but it also is edible. And another source of vitamin C, I forgot to mention with the yellow rocket, it was high in vitamin C and was known to be used as a cure for scurvy, as was this one. Again, another diuretic. So now this kind of has put us into June, when the grasses start to come into bloom and cause people allergy problems, if not sooner. I've come to the conclusion that just about every grass that you see growing along the roadside is an introduced species. Most commonly one of this set, which were the ones that have been most commonly used for agricultural reasons, particularly Timothy, brome grass, and orchard grass. Still very very much in use as for hay and pasture. The bluegrass, the Kentucky bluegrass, we're all familiar with. I think any of us that have a lawn know that the main species in Kentucky there is Kentucky bluegrass. There's also a Canada bluegrass, looks very similar. Just a note that both of those are misnamed. Kentucky bluegrass did not come from Kentucky, and Canada bluegrass did not come from Canada. They are both introduced species, and both come from Southern Europe. And all these other ones came from Europe as well. But the ones I really wanted to talk about tonight are ones that you may have more. Anybody who's had a garden or established a lawn probably has some familiarity with. This quackgrass goes by a variety of other names called couchgrass or couchgrass or twitchgrass. Used to be known as Agropyrons repens, but the taxonomists change the names of things all the time. Another one from Europe was quite here quite early in the settlement. Some thought that it was introduced as a potential hay crop that may have come as a contaminant in hay or in straw, but anyways, it got here and has done a very effective job at spreading itself all over in North America. If I remember correctly, it's been even found in Greenland, certainly well up into the Arctic as well, wherever people have attempted to cultivate the land and grow something or move machinery into. This was growing outside the library, by the way, a few years ago, by the way. You can see the head down here, which doesn't show terribly well. Grasses are hard to take a picture of, but it's a spike, flat, so with the spikelets on either side. It's spreads itself around very well because it's very good at producing rhizomes and sending up stems. And it doesn't reproduce by seed particularly well, but it does very effective at spreading by its rhizomes. This picture at the bottom is one that I took 40 years ago, probably before Roundup became quite as widely used as it is now. And it's quite possible that is one clone, all just spread around by the roots. It gets moved around very easily with tillage equipment, plows, disc cultivators. The picture in the upper right is one that one of my former colleagues with OMAF took back in the 70s sometime, I think. It was in a collection when I moved into the office in Alliston back in the early 80s. This is a sponge rubber ball, one of those red, white, and blue ones that got buried in the ground for some time. And as you can see, the quackgrass rhizomes have gone right through it. And I certainly remember from the days when I worked in the Alliston office with helping our potato specialist dig some of his plots. It was not unusual to find a potato tuber with a rhizome right through it. So put those kind of things together and you can understand why quackgrass used to be the #1 worst weed in any survey done with farmers. But now, thanks to Roundup and Roundup tolerant crops, it's very hard to find a field that looks like the one on the bottom, thank goodness. The other grass I want to touch on is reed canarygrass. It's pretty much, you can find it pretty much any wetland, any ditch, roadside, because that's the kind of habitat it does well in, quite competitive. It's interesting one in that there are both native and introduced strains of the same species. Thought that maybe the European one was brought in for hay or for erosion control because it does create a pretty good sod, protect soil, but it is invasive of wetlands. There is debate as to which one is more invasive, whether the native or the introduced is. one of the dilemmas is you cannot tell which is which by just looking at the plant itself. One needs to do a genetic test, and on the Minnesota website, I read an example of, in that case, they had a strain that they thought was native, but when they tested it, it turned out to have come from the Czech Republic. So that whole question of which one is invasive is still being sorted out. I guess their answer for Minnesota was, if you haven't got reed canary grass in an area where you don't want it, you need to consider any of them as potentially invasive. Sticking with the agricultural ones, as I said, with the grasses, most of the grasses that you'll find along the roadside are introduced. The same applies to just about everything in the clover family or bean family, however you prefer to name it. These are some of the ones you see more commonly. The top three, alfalfa, red clover, bird's foot trefoil, are still very much in use in agriculture. Alfalfas are predominant hay species. Red clover gets used if somebody needs some hay in the year of seeding because their alfalfa died out or whatever. It's now getting a lot of use as a cover crop after people harvest their summer cereals or their canola or those types of crops that leave the ground bare over winter. Trefoil is mainly a pasture species because it does not cause bloat in livestock. You can quickly look at the rest of them. They are not in any particular use in agriculture at the moment. The other one that you may be familiar with closer to home is white clover down at the bottom, because you may see it in your lawn as what we call white Dutch clover. But it is a strain of white clover. There's also a larger version that is used in pasture. Alsite clover is out there as well. It looks a lot like white clover, but it doesn't have the white marking on the leaf, and it's a little bit more pink, but it's not as anywhere near common as the other ones that I've showed here. Some that we might see more commonly and appreciate their as wildflowers more than what we just saw. There is the everlasting pea or wild sweet pea from Europe. Again, as most of these have been. Here quite early as an ornamental, no doubt, because it's not edible. It spreads both by seeds and by rhizomes, so in some areas it is considered to be an invasive species if it's showing signs of moving into an area and crowding out some other species that is more locally important. The other one that's much more recent was introduced in the 1950s and probably less well known is Crownvetch. If you want to see it being grown, I know there's some of it down in the area of the Balmy Beach boat launch. It's used very commonly along highway reconstruction, where you have a steep bank that otherwise would wash out. Quite commonly seeded to Crownvetch, and so the one area that I'm most familiar with is the drive south of Guelph on the new Highway 6. The banks along that stretch of highway are all covered with Crownvetch, which gives quite a striking purple display in July, and then the blossoms fall off and you get an ugly brown, but it's also used in soil rehabilitation, such as gravel pits or pit mines, because it does establish, once it gets established, it spreads well by rhizomes. Difficulty is getting it established in the first place, because the seeds take a long time to germinate, and so it's slow to get established, which is one of the reasons that never really was widely used as a agricultural crop. I would consider it to be potentially invasive in areas where it isn't deliberately being seeded to protect the roadside. For example, I saw some of it just this fall growing along the shore road on North Oliphant. How it got there, I don't know. But I would think that would be an environment where you don't really want it because of all the unique and rare special species that grow in that area. So it's one to watch for from that kind of concern. Well, I've got a couple of woody species that I'm going to mention tonight. This is one of them. It's again in the bean family. Black locust, honey locust, very fragrant, very popular, very good pollinator crop. It's it's native to North America, actually, a relatively small area in the Appalachians, and spread around by people, Europeans, settlers, both, I think, as an ornamental honey crop, and for its lumber, it produces a good hard lumber. It is considered an invasive or on invasive species watch because it does spread. It produces a great volume of little seeds, little beans in their pods, and doesn't spread a whole lot by root until you cut it down. And then, to use my grandfather's language, it comes up as thick as hair on a dog. So you can get a very, very thick cluster, which I guess thin themselves out in time, but and it's very, and the young growth is quite thorny, so it's something to be contended with. But if you don't have it and are concerned about introducing a species that is not native, it's one to watch for. It's not in the category of a Norway maple in terms of invasiveness, but it does have potential to spread itself around. The other woody group I'm going to briefly mention are the honeysuckles, the ornamental kind that you find growing around own farmsteads, and someplace they're quite attractive in spring with their blossom. These ones have come from East Asia, introduced here 100+ years ago as ornamentals. I always thought of them as a native North American species, but they are introduced. There are 4 species. The 2 most common ones are listed here, and there's a hybrid as well. So that they're really hard to identify as to which is which, but it doesn't really matter because they're all considered potentially invasive because of, besides having lots of the pretty flowers on them, they have lots of seeds, which the birds like. And the seeds are hard enough to go through the birds and spread honeysuckle plants all over the place. So one to watch for if you haven't, if you're thinking about bringing it onto your place, keep in mind that it may not stay where you put it. The climbing ornamental honeysuckle is in the same category as well as being potentially invasive. One that's less common but quite showy and might catch your eye and think, oh, maybe that would be a neat one to have on my place is yellow iris. From the area around the Mediterranean, again, it's been here in Canada over 100 years. It's brought in as for ornamental reasons in water gardens and that, or for that type of setting, but it has got loose in nature and is considered to be an invasive species because of it will spread by rhizomes. This cluster on the right is growing in a gully across the road from our house, habitat for marsh marigolds, and I'll give you an idea of the kind of terrain that it grows in. So it likes wet feet, does quite well there. And I can see over the years that the clumps of it are getting bigger. So I would imagine in due course it will take over that spot. So again, one to be cautious if you are attracted to it and think it might be a good one to have somewhere on your property. Wild carrot, well past this point of being considered invasive because it's everywhere. Interesting to me about this one when I was reading up on it is to learn that wild carrot is the same species as our vegetable carrots. The vegetable form had, of course, had a whole lot more selection, or as selection was the wild carrot has not. But the information that I read says that all parts of the wild carrot are potentially edible, from the flowers down to the roots, although the roots get woody and too tough to eat very quickly. But when the parts are small, they are edible. They even talk about having breaded wild carrot blossoms deep fried. It seems to me you're eating more bread, you're probably eating more bread than you are wild carrot, but whatever. It's been here very early. Whether it came in as a weed or as a vegetable, probably, or my guess would be it came in as a weed contamination of seed. Interesting tidbit, which I came across, again, I've heard other people make reference to it as well, is that in parts of the world it is used as a means of birth control. The seeds in sufficient quantities are a means to prevent implantation of the fertilized egg. So it's kind of a natural morning after pill, if you like. Apparently still used in parts of rural India, and reportedly even some areas of rural Kentucky, it's still part of the folk medicine. Chicory, very common, probably came as a vegetable, but it's also attractive and ornamental, and there is some use of it as a forage crop, pasture crop. Quite palatable and tasty to cattle, and it's now also some forms of it being used in cover crop mixtures because of the taproot for loosening up the soil. It came over here quite early, both as a potential, the leaves are edible when they're young. There are, again, a number of strains of the same species that are used in vegetables, Ondive, radicchio, or radicchetta being the more commonly ones. Of course, they've had selection. The coffee or chicory is probably best known as a coffee substitute, known for that use most recently during the wartime. It was interesting reading up on it is that there was quite a flurry of activity of growing coffee in Europe, or not coffee, as chicory in Europe in the late 1700s, because Frederick the Great decided that the good people of Prussia should not be drinking coffee, they should be drinking beer, as Prussians are supposed to. So he banned the importation of coffee. And so that created a great industry for a few years of growing chicory as coffee substitute. Frederick realized before too long that his ban was not working, so he made it legal again, but established a government monopoly on the importation of coffee. So I guess he probably got the last laugh in the end anyways. But so that is chicory. Viper's Bugloss, different family. This is the same family as forget-me-not or pulmonaria. So very diverse group. You'll see this one fairly commonly on areas that are harsh soils, gravel, roadsides, parking lots, where very few other things want to grow. It was been here for quite a while, early 1800s. Probably came in as a herbal medicine, because if you go on Wikipedia, you'll see a whole list of potential uses for it, none of which I'm going to list, because you'll find as many references to people expressing concerns about the safety of using it. because of the potentially toxic compounds that it contains. The name viper is because of its legendary use in Europe for curing snake bites. I wouldn't want to risk my life on that, but that had that reputation. The Bugloss is even a stranger name to my way of thinking. It's derived from the Greek word for ox tongue, because someone thought that the leaf of this plant looked like the tongue of an ox. But they have more imagination than I do. So far, nobody that I'm aware of has suggested this is a cure for COVID, but I'm sure that's just a matter of time. Can't do a talk about introduced species without giving mention to the knapweeds. That's kind of our Grey County flower in July. They are, again, widely spread. That's almost past the point of being considered invasive if you don't already have them, or unless you're in an area that doesn't already have them, because they are pretty much everywhere along the roadsides, old farmland, because they spread very well by seed. Nothing particularly wants to eat them. This is a pasture that generally unmanaged pasture, to call it that. So all that purpley colored stuff out there is knapweed. Kind of looks like before too long there won't be much else out there, and hardly anything else for the livestock to eat. And so it's considered a noxious weed by both the federal and the provincial government. Now, in its favor, the knapweeds are quite friendly to pollinators. You see bees and butterflies and beetles and all kinds of other insects attracted to their pollen, but I'm not going to promote it as a pollinator crop just because it is so invasive. As I say, most of this area, it's already all over the place, but there are parts of the Bruce Peninsula that don't have it yet, and it's on the watch list. And so if you're in an area that doesn't have it, be alert to it and get rid of it if it shows up. There are 4 main species. They all, 3 of them have that have the purple flowers. 3 of them have this type of shape of flower here with the disc florets in the center and the big ray florets around the outside. 1 does not. Another set of the 3, not the same set as this, but have leaves that look like this. They can be either notched toothed like this, or they can be smooth margins like that one. I think that's 2 different plants, but they may both be the same species. So neither the shape of the flower nor the shape of the leaves are much use in identifying the species. There's one exception on the leaves, which I'll talk about in a minute. So this is where you have to get into the minutiae of identifying the knapweeds, which we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on it, but it has to do with the structures of the bracts on the side of the flower head, whether they're pointed, whether they have branches on them, or whether there's green showing. But again, we'll leave that for another night. The one species that doesn't have the ray florets is the black knapweed. And the one leaf species that you can pretty well sort out based on the leaf is spotted, because its leaves are much finely divided, unlike the other 3. Of these 4 species, the only 2 that I want to say for sure that I have confirmed would be this Tyrol and spotted. I have yet to come across a population that I would say is definitely black or definitely brown, because those 2 hybridize. And so you can get a whole range of characteristics ranging from ones that look like very much like black to ones that look very much like brown, and every possible combination in between. So if you're having difficulty sorting out the species of knapweeds, and because nothing, it doesn't want to fit anything, you're probably dealing with the hybrid, which in my particular area, I would say is the most predominant form of knapweed. But regardless, they're all considered invasive. Getting near the end here, multiflora rose. As I indicated with grasses and the clovers, my perception is that any of the wild roses that you're likely to see along the roadside or on old farmstead are one of the introduced species. There's the multiflora rose. The other two more common ones that I've seen are dog rose and green sweet briar. They have fairly large pink or pale pink at least flowers, whereas the multiflora is white. Now I'll show you a close-up here in a minute. This species was brought in from East Asia as an ornamental. It was also used for rootstock for grafting other roses onto. It's been here in North America over 100 years. At one time, the United States Conservation Service decided that this would be a good species to use to reduce wind erosion on the Great Plains, so they planted it all over the place. And now the people that try to farm out there are spending their lifetimes trying to get rid of it. Because besides having lots of little flowers, it has lots of little rose hips that the birds like and spread around, and so it is one that falls into the category of another invasive species. It's very easy to tell from the other introduced roses because the flowers are white and they're small, a couple of centimeters diameter, and it also has this interesting stipules on the leaf. So that's multiflora rose. And finally, I put this one in for John Dixon. John keeps asking me about, David, what about species that went from North America to somewhere else in the world? Well, this is one. It's not native to this area, so for the most part, I think if you find it growing here, it is here, but it's usually in proximity to an old farmstead or on an old farmstead where it was used as a vegetable crop. It originated on the Great Plains dry land, as did the annual sunflower to which this one is related. But unlike the flat sunflower that stores its energy in the seeds, this one's main means of propagation and survival is in the tubers and the roots. So these pictures don't show the tubers very well, but they're about the size of a small knobbly potato, but reddish colored. It was used as a food crop by our indigenous people, and they moved it across northern United States for sure. It came to the attention of the Europeans fairly early. The Champlain is reported to have encountered it in his explorations in the early 1600s. And he is credited with giving it the name artichoke because he thought it tasted like an artichoke. And he brought it back to Europe. And it became quite well established as a vegetable crop in Europe. Also, as the tubers were used as a source of energy for various alcoholic beverages. So my perception is it had a lot more use in Europe as a vegetable than it did here. So the artichoke name is easier to figure out how it got put on it than the Jerusalem part. That there's varying theories about that, but it has no connection to Jerusalem in Palestine or Israel. One theory says it's a derivation of a European name for this species. There are other theories, but unless there's a town in Kansas named Jerusalem where this came from, that probably has no particular connection to it. location by that name. So that brings me to the end of what I was going to highlight, other than to note that new species are still being let loose in the environment. This is one that I came across last year across the road from our subdivision. It's one that doesn't show up in the checklist. It's Siberian Bugloss, same family as the forget-me-not. The flowers are a similar size to forget-me-not. The leaves get bigger, nice heart-shaped leaves, so it's quite an attractive plant. But given the nature of the species or the family and the size of seed, I would think this one has the potential to spread. So the take-home message for those of you who are gardeners or have friends of gardeners is please do not dispose of living plant material into the nature, and certainly don't throw away anything that's got viable seeds in it into nature. Dispose of them in the compost site or some suitable situation, because we don't need any more invasive species than we have. So thank you for your patience, and I will turn off the screen share and put my picture back on, and we can have some question and answers. There I am. So I think I see that all kinds of things in the chat box. Oops. Okay, I'm just trying to. So I don't see anybody asking any. Some people are commenting, but I haven't seen any questions yet. So, oh, here's one. Question about whether when we send plant material to compost site, does that not help spread it around? It would depend on the species and the nature of the seed. If it's a hard seed, yes, that's quite possible. The lighter seeds probably will get digested down in that area. So yes, that is a concern. Good point. How do you get rid of Crownvetch? Good. See, this is the danger of talking about invasive species. I would, short of spraying it with chemical that probably you don't want to use, probably the best you can do is to just keep mowing it off. Whether that'll work or not, I don't know. It's kind of a non-answer, but that's not one I've had before. Probably trying to pull it out isn't going to help because you'll leave some of the rhizomes behind. Somebody commented about chervil. No, I did not cover chervil because people will, as you have asked, how do you get rid of it? I don't know. The most effective way of getting rid of chervil that I have, if you have a small amount, is to dig it out, or because I've tried mowing it off, which often works with perennial species, but did not get rid of chervil. I'm not sure about what chemical. There are chemicals available for licensed pesticide applicators that can use on it, but they're not available for home use. What books do I suggest for plant identification? The two that I use most commonly are the Peterson Field Guide to the Plants of Eastern North America and nucums. I also, so those give me an idea where to look, and then I go to websites like Minnesota Wildflowers or Illinois Wildflowers, which, well, once I have an idea, and do a search there to see whether I've got the right thing. And then if I really want to get specific, there's you've got a very complete taxonomy guide out of Michigan called the I don't have it right here in front of me, but it's you need to know your botany terms to use that. Is goutweed considered invasive is the next question. Yes, any of the ground covers are considered invasive, whether it's goutweed or ivy or periwinkle. They are all considered goutweeds. They're just one big broad category for ground covers. So see what's over on this page here. So question about getting rid of knapweed by mowing at the right time of year. Maybe long enough, if you do it often enough, it's a short-lived perennial. So you might be able to wear it out, but there's probably a big enough bank of seeds in the ground to keep it present for a long time. Often with plants, you have to mow them off more than once because they'll regrow, and so you wear them down by repeated covering. Eileen O'Connor said that one of the sources of name for Jerusalem and Jerusalem artichoke is girasol, which is the French word for sunflower. I think I've also seen it as the Italian word, and that's certainly one of the theories. Oh. Sweet woodruff, was that invasive? I would say so. Because it's in the same family as the bedstraw, and I've certainly seen across on the neighboring property where it's been spreading around. It's probably not as competitive as some other invasive species, so it's hard to tell there. But as I said earlier, almost any of the ground covers are in the invasive category. John notes about Jerusalem artichoke that they are a popular food for deer that will paw through the snow to find the tubers as tasty sources of food. A friend of mine sees them out in the field doing that each year. Well, it's very interesting. Okay, I'm not sure how long you will. Yes, somebody asked about Michigan flora. That is the one that I was trying to remember the name of as the key to identifying just about everything that grows in Michigan, many of which we have here. There's the odd one that we have here that they don't, and vice versa, but it is a good taxonomic guide. And it does, fortunately, it has a glossary to help you sort things out. But, as with any of the keys, you need patience to work your way through it. But I also use it quite a bit when I get down to, well, is it this species kind of get narrowed down to a family and a species or that species. There's also a online version of that Michigan flora that you can go and look to if you don't want to buy the book. For those that are into plant identification, when I bought the book, it was available for $30 US, which is a steal for that kind of, because it's a government subsidized publication. It's available at a very subsidized price. So if you're looking for a taxonomy guide, it's one of the more economical ones to get, and covers most of what we have here. Okay, I see Pam's back online, so I will thank you very much for your attention and your questions, and I hope you found it interesting. Oh, one final comment, if you ever have not been on one of my hikes and wonder what they're kind of like a live version of what this evening's presentation was like. But more often focusing on the less common things, as tonight was about the more common ones. So thank you very much. And back to Pam.
Well, I would like to thank you, David, for all you've said, and I've taken notes. He will be on one of your hikes. I do enjoy your interest in everything, and I love your sense of humor. So thank you very much for having us tonight.